Disclaimer: this story is a mix of reality and fiction. Some scenes are taken from real experiences, while others are shaped by imagination. There may be moments of intensity, passion, regret, temptation, and perhaps even danger. This is not just a story. It's a confession. Good luck. The Ledger of Ghosts. Part 1. The Blueprint. The protagonist, Arthur Sterling, 68, a venture capitalist with a $400 million estate. The discovery, a series of microtransactions, and a forged codicil to his will found on a hidden flash drive. The twist: it isn't his estranged daughter or his greedy nephew. It's someone within his inner sanctum. Arthur Sterling, the deceased. Sharp, cynical, hiding in a refurbished basement apartment in a building he secretly owns. Helen, his devoted executive assistant of 20 years. Dr. Julian Vane, his personal physician and lifelong friend. James, the loyal chauffeur and former security detail. Chapter 1. The Funeral of a Living Man. The rain in Connecticut didn't care about Arthur Sterling's net worth. It lashed against the mahogany casket with a rhythmic thrum that Arthur found surprisingly soothing. From the second-story window of the caretaker's cottage, Arthur watched through binoculars as his own life was lowered into the earth. He sipped a lukewarm coffee, his chest tight. He had spent 40 years building a kingdom. He had spent the last 48 hours becoming a ghost. "They're crying," Arthur whispered to the empty room. He watched Helen, his assistant, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. She looked devastated. Beside her stood Dr. Vane, his face a mask of stoic grief. His family, the Vultures, were there too, looking more annoyed by the mud on their shoes than the loss of their patriarch. But Arthur knew better. 3 weeks ago, he'd found the Black Ledger digital file. Someone had been slowly draining his offshore accounts, setting up a paper trail that framed his own daughter for embezzlement. Whoever it was didn't just want the money. They wanted to destroy his legacy from the inside. He had faked the heart attack perfectly. A little digital manipulation of his medical records, a heavy sedative, and a very expensive bribe to a mortician who owed him a life debt. "Now," Arthur murmured, turning away from the window toward a bank of monitors. "Let's see who starts spending first." Chapter 2. The First Crack. For 10 days, Arthur lived in the shadows. He watched the hidden cameras he'd installed in his estate weeks prior. He expected his nephew to break into the wall safe. He expected his daughter to argue with the lawyers. But they didn't. His family was surprisingly quiet. The anomaly appeared on the 11th night. A figure entered Arthur's private study at 2 a.m. They didn't go for the safe. They went for the grandfather clock in the corner. Arthur leaned into the monitor. The figure moved with total familiarity, reaching behind the pendulum to retrieve a small brass key Arthur hadn't used in a decade. The figure turned, and the infrared camera caught the face. It wasn't a Sterling. It was James, the chauffeur. Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's draft. James had been with him since the beginning. He had saved Arthur from a kidnapping attempt in the 90s. He was the only person Arthur truly trusted with his physical safety. But as Arthur watched James open a hidden floorboard, one Arthur himself had forgotten about, he realized the betrayal went deeper than he imagined. James wasn't just stealing. He was looking for a specific set of deeds. Chapter 3. The Inner Sanctum. Arthur couldn't stay hidden anymore. He donned a heavy coat, a surgical mask, and a flat cap. He looked like just another elderly man wandering the streets of Greenwich. He followed James to a high-end social club, a place where James shouldn't have been able to afford the coat check, let alone a membership. Inside, Arthur watched from a corner booth as James sat down with someone. The second person was the real shock. It was Dr. Vane. "Is it done?" Vane asked, his voice low but captured by the directional microphone Arthur had planted in James's car earlier that day. "The deeds are secured," James replied. but the lawyers are being difficult about the offshore transfer. They need a biometric bypass. We have his thumbprint mold, Vane said coldly. We just need to wait for the heat to die down. The heart attack was a stroke of genius, James. No autopsy, no questions. Arthur's hand trembled. It wasn't one person. It was the two men he considered his only friends. They weren't just after the cash. They were stealing the real estate holdings to flip them to a shell company they'd co-owned for years. Part 2. The Cat and Mouse. The Digital Poltergeist. Arthur sat in the glow of 6 monitors, the blue light reflecting off his glasses. He felt like a god in a tomb. For 40 years, he had used his wealth to build walls around himself. Now, he was using it to tear down the sanity of the men who had betrayed him. He started with the small things, the things that made a man doubt his own memory. Dr. Vane was a man of precise habits. Every morning at 8 a.m., he sat in his private study at the clinic and checked the Sterling Estate Transition folder on his encrypted drive. Arthur watched through a backdoored webcam as Vane clicked the folder. It was empty. Vane froze. He clicked back, refreshed the window, and checked the file path. Nothing. Then a single file appeared, a PDF titled LazarusProtocol.pdf. Arthur watched Vane's face go pale. The doctor's mouse hovered over the file for a full minute before he clicked. Inside was not a legal document, but a high-resolution photo taken from the hidden camera in Arthur's casket. The view from the inside looking up at the lid. Vane shoved his chair back so hard it toppled. He scrambled to his feet, gasping, eyes darting to the corners of his office. He checked his door. It was locked. He checked his window. 3 stories up, Arthur took a slow sip of tea. Heart rate looks a bit high, Eris, he whispered to the screen. Perhaps you should see a doctor. The Haunting of the Estate. While Vane dealt with digital ghosts, James was dealing with physical ones. James had moved into the guest wing of the Sterling mansion under the guise of estate security during the probate period. He spent his nights drinking Arthur's 2,000-a-bottle scotch and pacing the hallways like he already owned the floorboards. At 3:14 a.m., the exact time the paramedics had declared Arthur dead, the mansion's integrated sound system hummed to life. It didn't play music. It played a recording of Arthur's breathing. The heavy, rhythmic sound of a man in deep sleep echoed through the vents. James bolted upright in bed, his service pistol drawn in an instant. He kicked open his door and sprinted toward Arthur's master suite. The room was empty. The bed was made, the sheets crisp and cold. But the breathing followed him. It seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Who's there?" James roared, his voice cracking. Arthur, watching from the basement of his rental property 3 miles away, toggled a switch. In the master suite, the smart glass windows, which Arthur had installed to tint with the sun, suddenly turned opaque, then clear, then opaque again, strobing in time with the breathing. Then, the voice command system activated. "James," the house's synthetic voice spoke, using a deep learning filter Arthur had spent the last 72 hours perfecting. "Why are you in my room?" James didn't answer. He turned and fled the room, his boots thundering down the marble stairs. He didn't see the tiny drone, no larger than a dragonfly, hovering near the crown molding, recording every second of his cowardice. The blackmail of the innocent. Between the scars, Arthur had to work. He spent the daylight hours tracking Helen. If James was the muscle and Vane was the brain, Helen was the hands. She held the keys to the digital kingdom. Arthur followed her via GPS on her company car. He expected to see her meeting them at a warehouse or a dark bar. Instead, he watched her go to a pediatric oncology ward. He hacked the hospital's visitor logs. She wasn't there for a child. She was there to pay a bill. A massive one. Arthur dug deeper into her personal finances, something he'd never done in 20 years because he'd trusted her implicitly. He found the leverage. Vane hadn't just recruited Helen. He was holding her brother's life-saving treatment over her head. The stolen money wasn't going to a tropical island. It was being funneled through a series of shell companies owned by Vane to pay for a charity medical trial that Helen's brother desperately needed. Vane wasn't just a thief, he was a puppeteer. The meeting at the pier. By the end of the week, the tension between the conspirators reached a breaking point. Arthur's hauntings had worked. Vane and James were no longer talking about the money. They were talking about whether Arthur was actually dead. "I felt the pulse, James. I signed the certificate," Vane hissed. They were standing on a fog-slicked pier at the edge of the Sound. Arthur sat in a parked van 50 yards away, wearing a janitor's jumpsuit and a gray wig, listening through a long-range mic. "Then explain the emails," James snapped. "Explain how his watch, the one we buried him with, showed up on my pillow this morning." "You're losing it," Vane said, though his own hands were shaking as he lit a cigarette. "It's the daughter. She's smarter than we thought. She's trying to break us so we make a mistake." "I'm going back to the grave," James said. Vane froze. "What?" "I'm going to the cemetery, tonight. I'm digging it up. I need to see his face. I need to know that old bastard is rotting, or I'm pulling out of the deal." Arthur, sitting in the van, felt a surge of cold adrenaline. This was the moment. He couldn't let them dig up an empty casket. Or worse, a casket filled with the weighted sandbags he'd used to fool the pallbearers. He had to escalate. He had to bring them all together for the third act. Arthur picked up a burner phone and sent a synchronized text to Vane, James, and Helen. Message. "The ledger is in the library safe. Midnight. Come alone, or the police get the password." Part 3. The false lead. The shadow in the hallway. Arthur's confidence was his greatest asset, but it was also his blind spot. After a week of playing the digital ghost, he began to notice something on his monitors that he hadn't programmed. Someone else was in the house. It wasn't James, whose heavy-footed pacing was easy to track. It wasn't Vane, who only visited during the day to consult with the family. This was a shadow, a slender figure in a dark hoodie who moved through the Sterling mansion with a familiarity that rivaled Arthur's own. They knew where the blind spots in the cameras were. "Who are you?" Arthur whispered, leaning into his screen in the basement hideout. The figure stopped at a portrait of Arthur's late wife. They stood there for a long time, perfectly still. Then, they reached up and adjusted the frame by a fraction of an inch. A tiny habit Arthur's daughter, Elena, used to have when she was a child. Arthur's heart hammered. He had assumed Elena was the victim of the frame job, the fall girl for Vane's embezzlement. But seeing her here, in the dead of night, using a bypass code on the service elevator that only the family knew, he felt a cold dread. Was she in on it? Had his own daughter partnered with Vane to push him into an early grave? The paper trailed to nowhere. Arthur redirected his focus. He stopped haunting Vane and started hunting Elena. He broke into her personal cloud drive. What he found devastated him. There were emails, dozens of them, between Elena and a Swiss bank official. The subject lines were clinical: liquidation of Sterling assets, succession timing, and final transfer. The dates on the emails started 6 months before Arthur's death. "No," Arthur groaned, clutching his head. "Not you, Elena. Not for money." The betrayal by James and Vane was business. It was a predator taking down an aging lion. But if Elena was involved, the last 20 years of his life had been a lie. He felt a sudden, violent urge to abandon the plan, to walk out of his hiding place and demand the truth. But he knew that if he revealed himself now, he would never know the full extent of the rot. He followed the money trail from Elena's emails. It led to a mysterious account held under the name Project Phoenix. Every time Vane stole $1 million, Elena seemed to be moving another $1 million into Project Phoenix. It looked like a coordinated strip mining of his empire. The midnight stakeout. Arthur decided to break his own rule. He left the safety of his bunker to follow Elena to a clandestine meeting. She drove to a derelict pier on the outskirts of the city. Not the one where Vane and James met, but a much grittier industrial dock. Arthur watched from the shadows of a rusted shipping container, a high-powered parabolic mic aimed at her car. A black sedan pulled up. A man got out. Arthur didn't recognize him, but the man handed Elena a thick envelope. "Is it enough?" the man asked. "It has to be," Elena said, her voice trembling. "Vane is getting impatient. If he doesn't get the final signature by Friday, he'll shut the whole thing down. And the old man?" "He's gone," Elena said, her voice breaking. "He's gone, and he'll never know what I did." Arthur felt like he'd been punched. He retreated into the darkness, his mind reeling. He was ready to write her off. He was ready to include her in the accident he was planning for Vane and James. The truth behind the lie. Back at the bunker, Arthur prepared to dismantle Elena's life alongside the others. But his finger hesitated over the execute key. His instinct, the one that had made him a billionaire, told him something was missing. The Project Phoenix account wasn't behaving like a thief's offshore stash. The money was moving out as fast as it was moving in. He stayed up until dawn, peeling back layers of shell companies that even the FBI would have missed. Then he saw it. Project Phoenix wasn't a bank account. It was a private investigative and legal task force. Elena wasn't stealing the money to spend it. She had discovered Vane's embezzlement months ago. But she knew Vane had the board of directors in his pocket. She knew she couldn't just accuse him. She needed proof. She was stealing the money to hide it from Vane, moving it into a legal war chest to build a case that would put Vane in prison for life. The man at the pier wasn't a co-conspirator. He was a former federal agent she had hired to track Vane's offshore movements. The false lead had almost cost Arthur his daughter. He realized that while he had been playing ghost, Elena had been fighting a war to protect his legacy, thinking she was all alone in the world. She wasn't his enemy. She was the only person truly mourning him. The pivot. Arthur sat back, the sun rising outside his basement window. The game had changed. He couldn't just scare Vane and James anymore. He had to coordinate with a partner who didn't know he existed. He had to feed Elena the final piece of evidence she needed, the smoking gun from his own private ledger, without letting her know her father was still breathing. He looked at the screen. James was cleaning his gun. Vane was drinking heavily. Elena was crying over a photo of Arthur at her desk. "Don't worry, Elena," Arthur whispered, his hand touching the monitor. "The old man is coming back, and he's bringing hell with him." Part 4. The Confrontation. The Invitation. The invitations were not sent by mail. They appeared on the screens of Vane's laptop, James's phone, and Elena's tablet simultaneously at 6 p.m. The ledger is open. The final audit begins at midnight. The library. "Come alone, or the inheritance dies with me." The wording was precise. To Vane and James, it sounded like blackmail from a disgruntled survivor. To Elena, it sounded like a ghost. The gathering. The library of the Sterling estate was a cathedral of mahogany and leather, smelling of old paper and the expensive cigars Arthur used to smoke. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Connecticut storm providing a jagged rhythm of lightning and thunder. Dr. Vane arrived first. He looked 10 years older than he had at the funeral. He carried a leather medical bag, but inside, nestled next to his stethoscope, was a compact sedative injection kit. He was a man of science. He intended to diagnose his blackmailer into a permanent sleep. James entered minutes later. He didn't hide his intentions. He kept his hand inside his heavy coat, fingering the grip of a Glock 17. He paced the perimeter of the room, checking the shadows behind the velvet curtains. "You got the message too," James stated, not a question. "Someone is playing a very dangerous game, James," Vane whispered. "Someone who knows too much." Elena was the last to arrive. She looked pale, her eyes red-rimmed, but she carried a briefcase full of the evidence she had spent months gathering. When she saw the two men, she recoiled. "What are you doing here? This was supposed to be about my father's private files." "It's about all of us, Elena," Vane said, his voice regaining its oily composure. "Sit down. Let's see who our host is." The voice from the walls. The clock on the mantel struck 12. As the final chime echoed, the heavy oak doors of the library clicked shut with a motorized finality. The lights dimmed, leaving only the amber glow of the fireplace and the flickering lightning from outside. "Good evening," a voice boomed. It wasn't a recording. It had the rasp, the cadence, and the terrifying authority of Arthur Sterling. James spun around, gun drawn. "Where are you? Come out." "Put the weapon away, James," the voice commanded. "You've always been a better hunter than a thinker. If you fire that gun, the halon gas fire suppression system will trigger. You'll be dead of hypoxia before you find the exit." James hesitated, the barrel of the gun trembling. "Father?" Elena whispered, her voice a mix of hope and pure terror. Are you alive?" "In a way, Elena," the voice softened. "But for some in this room, I am the day of judgment." The evidence. A projector hummed to life, casting a massive image onto the white screen usually reserved for stock market updates. It wasn't a will. It was a spreadsheet. "Dr. Vane," the voice said, "let's talk about the charity trial for Helen's brother. Or should we talk about the Cayman account where 40% of those medical fees actually landed? You didn't just steal from me. You turned my estate into a ransom note for a dying man." Vane went pale. "Arthur, listen. The research was expensive." "Quiet," the voice snapped. The screen changed. It showed James in the study, prying up the floorboards. "And James, my loyal shield. I watched you take the deeds. I watched you meet Vane at the pier. I gave you a life of dignity, and you traded it for a pile of paper you don't even know how to launder." "You're dead!" James screamed at the ceiling. "I saw them put you in the ground." "You saw what I wanted you to see," the voice replied. "You were so blinded by your own greed that you didn't notice the pulse was a trick of the light, and the grief was the only thing that was real in that room." The reveal. The tension broke when the hidden door behind the bookshelf, the one only Arthur knew about, creaked open. Arthur Sterling stepped into the light. He wasn't the frail man they remembered from the heart attack. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, his cane topped with a silver wolf's head. He looked like a man who had returned from the underworld specifically to settle a debt. Elena let out a sob and moved toward him, but Arthur held up a hand. "Wait, Elena. There is one more thing." He turned to Vane and James. "I have already sent the real-time recordings of this conversation to the district attorney. The Project Phoenix files my daughter so brilliantly compiled are currently being uploaded to every major news outlet in the state." Vane lunged forward, the sedative needle in his hand glinting. "You old fool, you can't." James was faster. He saw his life ending in a prison cell and decided he would rather go out for murder. He leveled the Glock at Arthur's chest. Click. The gun didn't fire. "I swapped your firing pin while you were passed out on my scotch last night, James," Arthur said coolly. "I told you. I've been haunting this house for a week." The resolution. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the Connecticut rain. Arthur looked at Vane and James with a look of profound pity. "You thought you were stealing from a dying man, but a man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous predator on earth." He turned to Elena, his eyes finally softening. "I'm sorry I made you fight this alone, but from now on, the Sterlings don't hide." As the police kicked in the front doors, Arthur didn't hide. He stood in the center of the room, the master of the house, watching as the shadows he had created finally led the guilty into the light. Part 5. The reconciliation. The sirens had faded into the damp Connecticut morning, replaced by the rhythmic ticking of the library's grandfather clock. The house, once a theater of ghosts, felt strangely hollow. James and Vane were gone, hauled away in steel cuffs, leaving behind only the scent of ozone and spilled scotch. Arthur sat in his high-backed wing chair. For the first time in weeks, he felt his age. The adrenaline that had sustained his resurrection was leaking out of him, leaving a brittle, tired old man in its wake. Elena stood by the window, watching the sun struggle to pierce the gray clouds. She hadn't spoken since the police left. "You're angry," Arthur said, his voice raspy. "Angry?" Elena turned, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I spent 3 days in a catatonic state, Father. I picked out your casket. I chose the hymns. I watched them shovel dirt onto a box I thought contained the only person who ever understood me. I had to be dead to them, Elena. If Vane suspected for a second, you didn't have to be dead to me," she snapped, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "I was fighting them. I was bankrupting myself to hire investigators to prove what they did to you. I thought I was honoring your memory. And all the while, you were watching me on a monitor like I was a character in a play." Arthur looked down at his hands. They were spotted with age, trembling slightly. "I've spent 40 years believing that trust is a liability. When I saw the Project Phoenix files, I realized I had raised a daughter who was better than me. I didn't hide from you because I didn't trust you, Elena. I hid because I was ashamed that I hadn't seen your strength sooner." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, the real ledger. He placed it on the table between them. "Everything is in your name now," Arthur said quietly. "The houses, the holdings, the shell companies. I'm legally dead, and I think I'd like to stay that way. The world is a predator, Elena. You've proven you can lead the pack. I just want to be a ghost who enjoys the silence." They sat in silence for a long hour. Eventually, Elena moved across the room and sat at his feet, leaning her head against his knee, just as she had when she was 6 years old. The reconciliation wasn't a grand speech. It was the quiet admission that the money had nearly destroyed them, and the lie had accidentally saved them. "Helen's brother?" Elena asked softly. "The trust is already set up," Arthur replied. "He'll have the best surgeons in the world, and Helen, she'll have a seat on your board. She earned it." Part 6. The Final Twist. 6 months later, the island of Tertera in the Azores was a place where the wind tasted of salt, and the locals didn't care about American venture capitalists. Arthur, now known simply as Mr. Silva, spent his mornings in a small cafe overlooking the harbor. He wore linen shirts and a straw hat. His face had tanned, and the hard lines of corporate warfare had softened into something resembling peace. He checked his tablet once a day, not for stocks, but for emails from Elena. She was thriving. The Sterling Empire was cleaner, kinder, and more profitable than ever. On this particular Tuesday, a woman sat at the table next to him. She was elegant, in her late 60s, wearing oversized sunglasses and a silk headscarf. "The coffee here is better than in Greenwich, isn't it?" she said, her voice a low, melodic hum. Arthur froze. He didn't turn his head. He knew that voice. It was a voice he hadn't heard in 25 years. The voice of the woman whose portrait he had watched Elena adjust in the dark of the mansion. "Rose," Arthur whispered, his heart hammered against his ribs. His wife, Rose Sterling, had died in a private plane crash off the coast of France 2 decades ago. There had been a memorial. There had been a closed casket. The woman tilted her sunglasses down, revealing eyes that were identical to Elena's. She smiled, a small, knowing thing. "You always were a slow learner, Arthur," Rose said. "You thought you were the only one who found out someone was after your money? You thought you were the only one who realized the only way to be free of the vultures was to stop being the prey." Arthur's mind raced. The plane crash, the lack of a body, the anonymous tips that had helped him build his fortune in the early 2000s. The way the Project Phoenix investigators had found information that should have been impossible to uncover. "It was you," Arthur breathed. "You've been watching us the whole time." "I was the original ghost, Arthur. I just wanted to see if you'd eventually join me in the shadows, or if you die in that boardroom." She gestured to the empty chair at her table. "The coffee is getting cold, and we have 20 years of secrets to catch up on." Arthur looked at the woman he had mourned for half his life. He looked at the horizon, where the blue of the sea met the blue of the sky, indistinguishable and infinite. He realized then that his mystery hadn't been a search for a thief. It had been an invitation to a much larger game. He stood up, pulled out the chair, and sat down. "Tell me everything," he said. Beyond the cafe, the Atlantic waves continued their eternal rhythmic pulse, indifferent to the lives of billionaires, the lies of ghosts, and the secrets buried beneath the surface.
For those who are watching, some of the names were changed to protect of the not-so-innocent. Thank you for watching and listening. There is more stories to come. If you like this content, please subscribe and a thumbs up. Please leave a comment of where you are from.